Today I want to talk about my favorite Targaryen, and that's Maegor the First Targaryen, also known as Maegor the Cruel, which is quite an unfortunate name, but we'll get there when we get there. Let's go through some of the lore that I like about Maegor, and then we'll delve deep into certain ideas and aspects. First things first, when Aenys dies, his mother, Visenya, comes after Maegor and brings him to Westeros. He claims the Iron Throne, and once a Maester protests, well, let's be honest, Maegor does what he knows best and uses his sword to decapitate him. Which makes sense, I would have done the same. But that's a different issue. During that time in Westeros, there was a problem with the Fate Militant, with the warriors of the Fate and the poor fellows who were ravaging the country in their zealous fever. And so, at some point, Maegor decides to ride on Balerion, go to Rhaenys Hill, and then challenge the warriors of the Fate, who respond by asking for a trial of 7, which is basically 7 dudes fighting 7 other dudes. And the winner is like the victor in front of the gods. Pretty interesting idea. When Maegor asks for warriors, none of those present, accept it. With the exception of, this is like the best part, a man-at-arms, a king's man-at-arms, who probably more than likely served under Aenys, and his name is Dick Bean. The hilarity of it is amazing. But after the knights get proven to be cowards by a guy named Dick Bean, the trial of the 7 commences. Maegor has his warriors, the warriors of the Fate have their own, and they clash. Maegor is the only one that survives, but he gets in a coma because of the fighting. This is in its own right a pretty cool aspect of the world of ice and fire, but as cool as it is, it leads to something more interesting. His second wife, because he had 2 of them, doesn't matter, comes with a healer, and she manages to bring him back in, 13 days or something like that. And then Maegor is back, and he starts to rule. But his brother, King Aenys, had children. Jaehaerys, Viserys, Rhaella, and Aegon the Uncrowned. Now, Aegon the Uncrowned was like the oldest of Maegor's nephews, and he really wanted that position. He really wanted to be king. He really wanted to follow in his father and grandfather's footsteps, his grandfather, of course, being Aegon the Conqueror. And so, we get the Battle Under the God's Eye, I think it's called. But that's going forward a little too much. Let's rewind a little. Maegor gets healed by a lady named Tiana of the Tower, who then he takes as his wife and makes her the spy mistress, his own spy mistress. Pretty interesting aspect. Now, let's move on. Aegon the Uncrowned wants his crown back, and Tiana finds out that there are some houses that aren't really pledged to Maegor and are waiting to see how things evolve. And can you guess who those houses are? Well, you don't have to guess because I'll tell you. House Baratheon, House Arryn, House Stark, and House Lannister. Little interesting foreshadow for the defeat of the Mad King, when you think that these are the houses that contributed to the deposing of the Targaryen bloodline from the Iron Throne and Westeros. But of course, we have to remember that George R.R. Martin is not J.R.R. Tolkien. He didn't have this whole story planned beforehand, but it doesn't matter. This is just a nice reflection to how things end up in the main timeline, during the whole present day era of Song of Ice and Fire. Now let's move on a little and go to the end of Aegon the Uncrowned's rebellion. Maegor, using Balerion, because Balerion was alive and he inherited it, kills his nephew and his dragon, Quicksilver. Now this brands Maegor as Maegor the Cruel by the people, and he's also known as a kinslayer, which is quite a stupid fact if you think about it well enough. If Aegon won, would he be called Kinslayer? It really depends. Jaime Lannister still keeps getting called Kingslayer, despite the fact that he kind of saved the realm and, the rebellious forces. And he still gets called out by people that he helped, like Ned Stark and Robert and so on. So we can presume that maybe even Aegon the Uncrowned would have been called a Kinslayer But seeing how many people in the universe of Song of Ice and Fire hate Maegor, I don't really believe it. I think Aegon would have just been called Aegon the Crowned, and be treated as a hero and not a kinslayer, despite being a kinslayer. That's a different story. I'm gonna skip now from here to an important part, an important aspect of Maegor's story is the fact that he has no heir. And not having an heir is a bad thing for a king. All kings should have heirs, but he didn't. And he did have quite a few wives. He had 3. One of them was a high tower, Cersei. The other one was Alice of something that went after Tiana of the Tower, and of course Tiana of the Tower. He then goes on to have 3 more wives, one of them his niece, but all their babies end up mutated. This is probably the most interesting aspect of the Targaryen bloodline and what is the story of the Valyrians and the Targaryens themselves. How did they become dragon riders and so on? And this is what fascinated me, is the fact that the children that Maegor has are mutated. They're worm-like. One of them is armless and legless and has 2 genitalia, and of course gets birthed at 3 months old and dies. He has another one that looks very similar to, and is described very similarly to the child that Daenerys has in Game of Thrones, the one that she ends up sacrificing for Khal Drogo, which is interesting, and it speaks to what really are the Targaryens in of themselves. And I think the Valyrians and, well, the Targaryens themselves are connected to something more interesting, something that I've made known that I really like on this channel before, and that is Michael Moorcock's Elric of Melniboné. And, well, the most important aspect to this is that Martin has consistently expressed his appreciation for Moorcock's work, even stating he read the Elric saga before Lord of the Rings, but that's what Google's telling me, so take it with a grain of salt, that aspect. Many would even say that Brynden Rivers, Bloodraven, is an homage to Elric of Melniboné. But there's an interesting aspect here, because when you look at the Valyrians as a race, you find many aspects of the Melnibonians in them. For example, the Valyrians are a race of striking, otherworldly beauty, technically, which otherworldly is just thanks to their white hair and purple eyes, whatever. But the Melnibonians are otherworldly, or an otherworldly elf race, descended from dragons. Remember that? Descended from dragons. We'll get there. The Valyrians, we know that they practiced blood magic and did many cruel and horrible things and other dark sorceries. And you guessed it, the Melnibonians also used dark sorceries, but they also worshipped an entity of chaos. Both of these races have a caste of dragon-riding nobility, and both of them commanded a vast empire thanks to those dragons. Of course, their civilization ultimately collapsed as a result of certain aspects. We can pretty much try and deduce what it is for the Valyrians, what brought the doom of Valyria, but for Melnibonians it's pretty easy, and it's simply to say that Elric is responsible, as he had all those dreams and those prophecies that said he would kill the Dreaming City, and of course his whole empire. But I said something interesting earlier, and I want to go through it. It's clear that the Valyrians and Targaryens are inspired by Melnibonians, but the Melnibonians are descended from dragons, and that's probably the most interesting aspect here, because there are many theories that say that the Valyrians combined blood magic and combined wyverns with fireworms to create these dragons, basically wyverns that can spit fire, which is interesting in its own aspect. But we have certain excerpts from the books, for example, Daenerys riding, I think, Balerion, and thinking about how she read how the old Valyrians used to have horns to bind the dragons. There's also an interesting theory that the Valyrians mixed with the dragons and combined their blood so that, well, they could ride them. And it's interesting when you look at people like House Stark or House Reed, who are known to have green seers, wargs, people that can change their skin. So we know there is some sort of magical way to do this, to bind your soul to things, to create this connection somehow and put it in your bloodline. And I do tend to believe the theories that say that, well, the Valyrians binded their souls to dragons and that's why they end up like this. But in the case of Maegor, we see the other position of this whole being descended from dragons. We see that in certain cases, well, the seed is weak. Especially in the case of Maegor the Cruel. His seed, completely weak, all those mutations and so on are just falling upon his head, and none of his children survive, or at least die looking normally like human beings. And we can see that in Daenerys. But if you remember well enough, what screwed Daenerys and her child was the ritual, the blood ritual that happened to save Khal Drogo. So there was some magic involved there, and there is this theory that maybe the seed wasn't weak in Maegor the Cruel. Maybe that wasn't it. You see, later on, of course, Maegor takes 3 more brides. 2 of them just die, and they have monstrous children. He gets his revenge, whatever, kills some houses, destroys Harrenhal as you do. You can't be a king in Westeros without burning Harrenhal or destroying it or doing something bad to it and give it to a poor stab that has to deal with the curse. But that's a totally different issue and totally different thing. Tiana of the Tower gets accused of being responsible for Maegor's children ending up as mutations, abominations, and, well, dying. And here's an interesting aspect. People under torture will say anything to get out of torture. It happens in Maegor's story that at some point he tortures like 20 people, and all but 2 of them confess to having slept with one of his wives so she could bear him an heir. Tiana tells him that thing. How actually true that might be or not, we don't know. But Maegor decides to kill them all and then destroy Alice's house, because that's the name of the wife of Alice Harrow, I think it was. Yeah, Alice Harrow. And here we have Tiana of the Tower being sent to get tortured, and she tells Maegor that she's responsible. Before any torturing can happen, she tells him that she poisoned his wives so that all his children would end up that way. And she promised him that his next one will also, not survive. Maegor, of course, kills her. Logic. I mean, can't blame him. And the thing comes true. That's when he loses another wife. That's when Maegor loses another wife and another child. So how much of it is it really just Valyrian incest and mutations like coming out during his, procreation sessions? And how much really is it Tiana messing with Maegor? Because she took care of him for like 13 days and then he woke up from the coma. And of course all his children are abominations that die. So we can pretty much presume that Tiana of the Tower can also be responsible for Maegor's children dying. It's not only, it might be both in a way. It might be the fact that the Targaryens, the Valyrians, combining their blood with dragon souls and doing blood magic affects them down generations. And whatever Tiana did to bring him back from the coma might have messed up with him. Both things can be true at the same time. But there is another interesting case in Game of Thrones, and that's Sir Robert the Strong. Presumably the Mountain. Confirmed to be the Mountain in the show. Now, he dies, gets poisoned and all that jazz by Oberyn Martell, which I hate, and I'll probably talk about why I hate him in another video. And Master Quiburn just sticks him up together and does something to him. And whatever he does to the Mountain, it brings the Mountain back to life. As a monstrosity that can't speak, but he is alive. who's to say Diana of the Tower didn't do some messed up things to Maegor the Cruel in those 13 days and just modified him and just turned him into a more intelligent and human-like Robert Strong, the Mountain. It is a possibility, and it's an interesting thing to look into. And again, we have the case of Daenerys, whose child ended up being a monstrosity in its own right because of blood magic. If we look into Diana a little bit, there's not that much information. It is presumed that she became the mistress of Maegor at some point. What we know for certain is that Queen Alice brought her from Pentos, where she was a courtesan. But the world of Ice and Fire, the untold history of Westeros and Game of Thrones, mentions that she was said to practice sorcery and alchemy. Now, alchemy is a thing that the Valyrians did dabble into. Of course, the Pentoshi and most of the Free States, whatever, would probably have an inclination to at least search it up a little. The curiosity there. So that's saying something. But let's look at the same book to this fragment, this little excerpt here. For 27 days, Maegor was dead to the world. On the 28th, Queen Alice arrived from Pentos. Maegor was still without issue, and with her came a Pentoshi beauty called Tiana of the Tower. She had become Maegor's lover during his exile. It was clear, and some whispered Queen Alice's as well. The Dowager Queen, after meeting with Tiana, gave the king over to her care alone, a fact that troubled Maegor's supporters. So this tells us that Tiana had a few days to work on Maegor and heal him. And I've made a mistake. I think I've said 30 days, it took 13 days to heal him up. But no, because right after we have another excerpt that, is interesting. On the 30th day since the trial of 7, the king awoke with the sunrise and walked out onto the walls. So it took her 2 days to put Maegor back together and heal him from his coma. And I like this aspect about Maegor. I like the fact that this is really a big question when it comes to him. Was it really that his seed was weak? That the whole Valyrian Targaryen interbreeding with dragons and soul bindings and stuff really messed up a few generations later or something like that? Or was it just magic, and like in the case of Daenerys? I guess we will never know, but it is interesting to look at it and see the inspiration, because it makes sense, right? Melnibonians, dragon descendants, the Targaryens are basically Melnibonians, the Valyrians are Melnibonians. It would make sense that it would be something natural that happens because, some recessive genes at some point mess up and, Maegor, these are all your babies. Have fun, you're never gonna have an heir. I think that's pretty interesting in its own right, and we can always blame Tiana of the Tower, because when she predicted that Maegor's next kid would end up dead and a monster is the one with 2 genitalias at the same time, then she was correct with that one. She wasn't lying. Now, was it true because she really did that out of jealousy because she couldn't give Maegor an heir? Is it because it was the price that had to be paid to save him from his coma? Who knows? Who knows if it was intentional or not, or, as I've said before, an accident. But I think things are too connected for it to just be an accident. Maybe the seed isn't weak, and I think Diana of the Tower is responsible in one way or another. Maybe she really did poison those women and their children. Maybe she really messed up Maegor. We'll never know because Maegor doesn't live much longer after that, after he kills her. But nevertheless, it's an interesting subject to discuss. Of course, I would want to hear what you have to say, and if you managed to reach this far, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, because it helps the channel grow. I'll see you in the next one.